Understanding leadership as a concept and a process can be difficult enough on its own. And in fact, people often mean many different things when they refer to leadership. The most common misperception is seeing management and leadership as the same thing, and they are very different kind of approaches. But leadership itself is a matter of influence. That is, very intentional influence that helps others achieve what they could not do on their own. And that is the core nature of it all. But this necessarily means, though, that leaders must understand far more than we often admit. We tend to think of it as being a baseline, a general idea of what's going on. But to influence people, you need to actually understand some things about everything that affects those people. Leaders must understand situations at a level that people, for the most part, do not usually consider. They must also understand people as individuals as well as people en masse. So if they're going to be able to lead them well, that you cannot simply look out and see a crowd and lead a crowd. You lead individuals that are part of that crowd. Leaders must also understand not just their own role, but also all the other roles that make a group of people come together as a living organism where everyone participates and cooperates. That's an essential part of it. And they must also understand an organization's past, congregation, for instance, to help them achieve the brightest future. Well, Nehemiah, if you'll turn to Nehemiah chapter 7, Nehemiah understood all these things as he set forth to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, leaving a very nice job in the palace to do so, but also to rebuild God's people in the process. When we turn to Nehemiah 7, we find that he had already accomplished much of what his original task was in talking about rebuilding that wall of Jerusalem. He's already done that. As we turn and look, and we're just going to start by reading the first 5 verses of Nehemiah 7. Then it was when the wall was built, and I had hung the doors, when the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, that I gave the charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. And I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they stand guard, let them shut and bar the doors, and appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, one at his watch station and another in front of his own house. Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not rebuilt. Then my God put it into my heart to gather the nobles, the rulers, and the people, that they might be registered by genealogy. And I found a register of the genealogy of those who had come up in the first return, and then found written in it. And he continues to go and quote from something that we find in the book of Ezra. Now, the lessons that we see here in these few verses and what are implied in this long list that follows are actually, while they're subtle, they're very powerful and important lessons when it comes to what leaders must understand. You cannot simply step into the role of leadership. It doesn't work that way. No matter what title you're given, whether you're talking about moving up and you're becoming a CEO, anybody can be put in a position of CEO. That doesn't mean they can do the work of a CEO. You have to know what's behind it and what goes into it in order to accomplish those things. And that is true for leadership at every single level that you find it. And so you have to understand a number of factors going into it and what's required of you. And the first thing that I want us to note is found here, both in verse 1 and in verse 4, is that understanding leaders understand changing needs. Notice what he said. Then it was when the wall was built and I had hung the doors, when the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed. Now, that was the start of a sentence, but notice what had happened. The basic job, the first job I came to do, was done. These things are all taken care of. I've put them in my past. Verse 4, now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not rebuilt. Now notice what he has just done. He's recognized that he went to Jerusalem because there was one need, He has fulfilled that need, but then he recognizes that there are still other needs that need to be taken on. And so understanding that needs change is actually vital to the role of an elder. It's vital to any kind of leader to understand that as you go about, things don't stay the same, and you have to address them at a level of recognizing when these change, what is changing and why, and how it's going to affect people. And so leaders must base their thinking and their work in principle, because situations and needs change constantly. That is, if we focus only on trying to carve out, here's how everybody's doing at this very moment and everything's fine, then we don't understand that people change, what people can do change, what their individual needs are as a family or as individuals. Those change, and you can't just leave it rock solid, get everything out there on paper and think that what's on paper is reality. Why? Because situations are changing all the time. So leaders must be aware of what is needed most at a particular time, and then be able to adapt to that need for the greatest benefit of the congregation as a whole. So when we look at these needs, we need to recognize what we're talking about of what the type of needs we see. When you see that these needs are changing, you need to recognize that needs change as numbers change. And this is true in a congregation, to be sure, is that what a congregation needs when they are one size is very different when they're another size. And a congregation is usually in flux one way or another. You are growing, you're getting smaller, and that can be for a number of reasons. It could be that your location ends up being a problem. That's true in the inner city in places, and it's true in rural areas that numbers go because they don't have the people anymore. It can be because the age of the congregation is getting older and older, and those people are not being replaced, and the numbers go down. It could be that is in a growing area, and you're getting all this influx of people. But as those numbers change, the needs of the congregation are going to change vastly. When you go and you look in Acts chapter 2, verse 41, we find that on that first Pentecost, that 3,000 obeyed the gospel. That was a very different situation than when Paul was in Athens in Acts 17, verse 16, and he was by himself. The needs were different, and you see that reflected in the situations and how they were addressed. Also, needs change as demographics change. Demographics is a big word that means what are the statistics about people, essentially. Well, we see in Acts chapter 6, verse 1, that there was a particular demographic group that wasn't having their needs met. And that is, there was a distinction between the Hellenistic widows and the Hebrew widows. Now, they were all Jews, but culturally they were different and they were being treated differently. And so a lot of times we don't appreciate that all of a sudden we try to do everything the exact same way instead of realizing that there can be cultural changes and cultural shifts that you have to address in one way or another. If it is a shift that is against the Bible, then you stand firm. But if you recognize that there is a cultural shift that has to be addressed in some way, then you find what is the best way to address the need. Now notice you're thinking of it as a need, and a need means you are trying to improve the situation. You don't just accept a need. When you're hungry, you don't just say, hey, I'm hungry, and leave it at that. You go find some food. So that's what we have to understand about the nature of needs. But that also means then there's these different changes that are coming on, and you've got this demographics. Is it sometimes that is going to be culturally based? It could be ethnic changes, we've already seen that there's going to be a difference. You know what? Sometimes that means you make some allowances and recognizing there are going to be differences. And you don't just say, no, we're going to stay, here's how we are. We see there's a need here. Let's meet that need. And we address it. We also realize, though, that needs change as situations change. In 1 John chapter 2, 12 through 14, he is discussing this in the context of people. And he addresses essentially three different age groups. He talks about the young men and then the men and then the older men. And he is looking at them, and he addresses them based upon their individual situation. Now, we see that same principle played out in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 14 and 15, and how you deal with people who are having spiritual issues, the weak, the disorderly, those kind of things. But here's what I want you to think about when he addresses even people, all who are faithful and doing well, but they are different. Your needs are not the same when you are young as when you are old. This is true in a physical way, it is true in a spiritual way. And so we have to make sure that as that spiritual items change, we are also recognizing that people's situations can change spiritually. The person, for example, in one way, isn't going to be having to address certain problems. When they've got young children, that's a separate set of issues when you've got young children. When you've just had a baby, you're just trying to make sure you're sleeping enough not to die by morning, right? That's your first goal. But when you come up and they get older, the needs of those children change. That means what you do with them changes. And you're having to address things. You're doing different things with them. And then you hit that age and all of a sudden, mom becomes a taxi driver because the kids have to go all these places. It's a different kind of situation. It has to be addressed. But you know what? That's true spiritually too. Because the same parents who right now, when they've got young children, they're not having to address certain moral issues with their children. They're not having to make the same kind of decisions about morality and about modesty with their young children, that when they get older, you think, well, they're doing great, but when they get older, they're going to have to be addressed for those issues because they haven't really been tested on them yet. Why? Because their situation changes. And we have to adapt on an individual basis as well as at group levels to address people where their situations are at a given moment. Needs also change as goals change. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, we find that the goal that Jesus set before he left the earth was that the gospel, he was going to send the Holy Spirit, and from then in Jerusalem, the gospel would be forth, it'd be from there in Judea, Samaria, and the other parts of the world. So notice that beforehand, the thinking had been pretty localized about what was required. But as those goals change, here's what we're trying to accomplish, then the needs change too of what is required to accomplish the goals. If all we're going to do as a congregation is show up, keep house, and make sure someone is here to perform everything that's done here on Sunday, that's a very basic need in the church. Right? If we're going to do more than that, then the needs are different. Now, according to what God says, we better recognize that those are God-given things to address. But that means that there's more to it and more things have to be addressed. That as our goals change, that we're wanting to accomplish more, then we have to recognize what those goals are and what it takes to achieve those goals. That becomes a need. Once you set a goal, everything that's required to meet that goal becomes and needs to be treated as a need. And therefore, we have to meet that need as we go forth. Then we look at Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. Needs change as people change. That is, you can't just put everyone into one kind of corner and treat them the same way. In Titus 2, 1 through 8, Paul is directing Titus on how he is to address various people. He addresses them essentially in 4 different ways. He talks to the younger women, to the young men, to the older women, and to the older men. And so he uses both your gender, and guess what? For Paul, that really wasn't a problem in understanding. And have y'all not been paying attention to the news? It wasn't that hard to understand. Men and women, younger and older. Now, where those exact lines of younger and older are, that can change based upon a number of things. But the point was, though, in all those situations, is that we need to see that those needs are different. And the responsibilities are different in meeting needs. If you recognize, even in that text in Titus chapter 2, 1 through 8, what we found was that he was giving, as you become an older woman, you have a responsibility as you are teaching the younger women. So whenever that does happen and changing, now not just your need change, but your responsibilities change. The same thing is true with men. But to recognize those things, and as people are changing, and sometimes the problem is people aren't changing enough, they're not growing. But regardless, you have to be willing to address it. Life is change, and what we need is muscle, flexibility, and awareness. Second of all, whenever we think about what needs are and what we're needing to understand as leaders, understanding leaders understand whom to trust. Look at verse 2 now. That I gave the charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. Because there's so many things to do and we've already got all these needs, then someone has to address the needs. But that requires leaders to know whom they can trust to best deal with those needs and be a help in the process rather than dragging the whole process down. And that makes a big difference in what happens in the church based upon who is doing what and whether or not the people can be trusted to do it. That's why leaders have to understand people extremely well. This means it's important for a leader to be able to recognize both the strengths and weaknesses, even if those people do not see them. Both strengths, and a lot of times we think we see everyone's weaknesses. By the way, if you are an expert in seeing everyone's weaknesses, my guess is you don't understand what your biggest weakness is. We also need to make sure we recognize everyone's strengths. Because a lot of times what I have found is that a lot of people don't even know their greatest strengths and know what they have to offer and bring in the church. That they haven't been developed or they haven't been used in that way, and we need to recognize to bring those people on board and seeing those hidden strengths. We have to do that. Leaders also must then, in seeing those, they must recognize it as essential because they've got to sense whom they can trust implicitly with sensitive information and difficult assignments. Because there are going to be plenty of things that are both difficult and sensitive. And you have to know whom you can trust to deal with those things well and to handle it and who you can't. The last thing you need is someone who doesn't know how to handle delicate information and put them in a position of leadership. And I just got political. This is not happening on purpose. It's the nature of the lesson. They need to know, leaders do, who will be with them when problems arise and criticisms begin. Who's going to still be there? Because there are going to be issues that come up and problems. And they need to understand that and to recognize on what basis that relationship exists. Now, to understand the difference, there are a number of people, preachers, for example, over the years, that I might have stood with against a particular problem or for something, but then they changed. And they no longer stand for the same things, or they got into some kind of moral issue. I have to know why I'm standing with that person, and that it's not based upon a personal relationship and friendship or political alliance. It's based upon truth and spiritual things. So we have to know why we're standing with people, and that means why we have to know them very well. Because leaders need to know who will do what they promise to do every time. They need to know. And they need to recognize that because of the types of assignments and responsibilities that they need to be able to give out. So, how does this affect us in a more practical way? Well, to see who they should do and look to, the first thing is trust people, leaders, that you know extremely well. And the example we consider for this is found in Philippians chapter 2, 20 through 22. Because when Paul sends Timothy to the Philippians, he describes him as one, he says, who cares just like I care, who has the same heart that I do. No, do you understand what it takes for someone who's inspired and who, remember, was not willing to take Mark along the second time on a journey? So we've got someone who he has very high standards for his expectation. So to be able to take him along and say this about him, that I have no one who will show the same care that I do like Timothy. That's the type of person that you really know well, that you can predict what they will do without any question. But also, you have that kind of level of understanding of someone, but you have to also trust people who take responsibility seriously. That is, they're very conscientious people, and they know what it means to say, okay, here's what something's been given, and here's what I need to make sure and get done. Colossians chapter 4, 12 through 13, we find Paul talking about Epaphras. In this way, of here's this one who has been a preacher, and he's talking to him as they knew him and how he could be trusted. because of the work he was doing in going around here and taking the message of the gospel. He was doing work that Paul couldn't do. Paul wasn't sending him specifically, but he was talking about, here's someone that I know takes his role and his work very seriously. We have to understand that you can't get a lot of things done if we're going to take serious things in a flippant manner. You know, if the role is to make sure that we are trying to accomplish some big goal as a congregation, you want to make sure that person takes it seriously rather than just, well, I'll get to it when I get to it. It's a big difference, and that's why you have to know whom you can trust as a leader. And that means, as we notice in our text here, trusting people who are faithful. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, Paul was writing to Timothy, and he gave him this charge that he was to take the things which he had heard of him, he says, among many witnesses, commit the same, he said, to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Don't commit it to just anybody. Now, he's talking about the responsibility of passing on the important lessons of preaching and helping people. He says, you don't trust just anybody with that. And so he says it needs to be someone who's faithful, someone that you know is with God and is standing with God, and they're going to be with God, and you don't have any questions about. Now think about what happens many times, and we've seen it years past now here in this congregation, before I was even here. We've seen it in other places, years ago in preaching schools, and I can name just about every single one it's happened to, where someone in a position of trust then acted in a way that was very distrustful. And then you start wondering, you start looking back and saying, what were they thinking in that time leading up to their complete apostasy? How did that affect their leadership right before? We trusted them, and it shows that a lot of times we don't understand, we put our trust in people for the wrong reasons, and that's why it's so important for leaders to know the difference. We have to trust people of high character. In 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 12, the qualifications are given of both elders and deacons. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, and you can go all the way through verse 16 if you wish, you see those essential qualifications of preacher. That ought to be our starting point. That here's what I know about this person. Not here's what I hope is true, but here's what I know. And that is the basis upon which here's why I can trust that person. Now, in business, it operates in a little bit different way, but the principle is still true. That you need to be able to trust people if you're going to really hand things over to them, you got to really be able to have a lot of trust so you know what's going to happen afterwards. The most expensive thing in the world is trust. It takes years to earn and just a matter of seconds to lose. That is true in marriage, and it's just as true in other relationships between Christians and in leadership. Thirdly, understanding leaders understand delegation. Notice verse 3. And I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they stand guard, let them shut and bar the doors and appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, one at his watch station, another in front of his own house. The art of delegating is essential for good leadership, and that's why a good worker is not the same as a good leader. One does not automatically translate to the other. Because a leader must know how and when to give other people assignments and know what assignments to give to whom. You can have assignments and you just then pick a name out of the hat, and trust me, that's not a good way to go about it. You have to know the people and know how they will work best in what assignment if you're really wanting that done well. And so this is the only way for a group of people to maximize impact. To be able to make sure you're doing the most you possibly can with the resources you have. And the resource that we have in the church first is people. That's how it was designed. It's one of those interesting things. We make sure to point out to people that the church is not the building, the church is the people. But we fail to appreciate the fact that the people is also the main resource of the church. So otherwise, the leaders will spend too much time doing the basic work instead of the work of leadership, because they're having to go back to try to take care of things that should have been delegated and maybe were, but weren't delegated in the best person possible. So here's some things about delegation to understand as a leader. The first is you have to accept that you cannot do everything yourself. In Exodus 18, verse 18, Moses' father-in-law comes to him saying, as Moses is taking on all this judgment from morning to night, and he says, this thing you do is not good. It's not a good thing for you to try to take all of this on yourself. You need to delegate some of this responsibility, and you only take the harder, more difficult things that you alone can handle. So you have to, first of all, recognize there's a need for delegation instead of trying to say, okay, I'm going to control all this, because that doesn't work very well. The second thing is, you have to understand in delegation is you have to go out and involve and grow others. If you've got a role, you need to delegate. You have to consider, what have I done to get this person involved and grow them to where they can do this job? That's an implied necessity if you're going to hand a job over to them. In Acts chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, that's where we find that the apostles told the church to look out among them for people who were qualified, and they gave them certain characteristics. And they chose these 7 men that would then take over this role, and the apostles then delegated this particular role of taking care of the widows to that group of men. They did other things as well, as we see from both Philip and from Stephen, but this was something they were originally selected to do. I also hope you saw that from our text itself, part of understanding delegation is you give instructions as necessary. That whenever you look at what he was saying, he was very specific in saying, here's what you need to do. Here's what I'm telling you to do. I'm giving you this assignment. I'm going to ask you to handle it, but here's what I need. It was very specific. It was straightforward. It was enough to where you could be held accountable and be responsible, and then it's going to be known whether or not you handle it or not. That's delegation. It is saying, put it in a package. Here's what I need done. Here's the means by which I need it done. Here you go. Take care of it. It's yours. Now I don't have to worry about it. That's what delegation is. If you're having to always be over the shoulder on somebody, then something's wrong and you're delegating. That doesn't work well, and it doesn't accomplish what you intended because it's not saving you a bit of time, and your attention's in the same place no matter what. Also, you need to, if you're delegating to people, part of the role is to encourage their leadership in as far as you've delegated it. If you notice what he did, he was saying, here, you take care of this. This is your responsibility. And he's saying, I trust you, and you're going to be able to handle it. That's the message that you need to be able to give to anybody to whom you delegate some kind of role, is saying, I trust that you're going to take care of this, and you're capable of taking this on, and you can do it. And so as we do this, you need to be able to recognize and encourage them to grow themselves as leaders. Now think about what happens if you don't do that. If you don't encourage them to continue to take on other roles as you delegate to them and grow in that, then when the need is for more leaders at the level, you've never developed any leadership. There ought to be always a developing of leaders going on, and delegation is one means, an avenue to do that. You also have to match people to responsibilities. It's interesting in Acts chapter 9, 15, and 16, and this is repeated in Acts 22, I believe, when it talks about Paul. Have you ever realized that Paul was specifically, he was going to be the one sent to the Gentiles, and specifically that was being sent to the Romans, because there were other apostles that were sent to other Gentiles. When it's specified in that way, he was being sent to Romans. Why? Because he was uniquely suited. Based upon his education, his citizenship, and background, he was uniquely suited to that particular role among all the apostles. And so what delegation is you look and say, who is best suited for what the needs are, and hand those things over to them. Be mindful then of the need and the people, and match them up to the best of your ability. Sometimes you have to stretch people. You may not have someone that is naturally has a strength in an area that you need. And therefore you find the person who's most able to stretch and to take on new things. But as best as possible, it's good to put people in positions in which they can excel. Why? Because they're going to appreciate it and they're going to do best for you doing that. But in the end, you still have to hold them accountable. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 13, it is interesting that right after he talks about the qualifications of elders and deacons, he talks about the difference in those who serve well. That is, here's what our expectations are, but in the end, the question is how well do they serve? So there's got to be accountability at every level, or else how do we ever know if they did what they were supposed to do? So we have to find a way to make sure that that is true. So in this process, Ronald Reagan described it in this way. He says, surround yourself with the best people you can find, delegate authority, and don't interfere as long as the policy you've decided upon is being carried out. Make sure it's done. Remember, you've set it out. Here's what we need to be done, take care of. As long as it's done based upon the parameters you give, that ought to be exciting to you as a leader. Fourthly, understanding leaders understand the background. Now, we looked at verse 5 now, and this really encompasses all of what we see in the rest of the chapter. Then my God put it into my heart to gather the nobles, the rulers, and the people, that they might be registered by genealogy. And I found a register of the genealogy of those who had come up in the first return, and found written in it, and then he lists all the names based upon their various roles and functions. We tend to think that a person's history began when we first met them. That's not fair to them, and it's not good for us. Why? Because we need to see people and everyone in the congregation as a whole, as a product of the actions and decisions that have been made over time, or we're going to fail to appreciate all the struggles that we face today and have for the future. So let's consider quickly. When you think about the background, you have to consider how the congregation reached its current situation. That's what Jesus pointed out to Ephesus in Revelation 2, verses 2 through 5, where they came from, what they had their background, and I wanted them thinking about, how did you get to this point? That's important for leaders to understand so that we realize these problems we have now, there are probably things that happened in our past that are at the root of it. Second of all, appreciate and learn from the efforts of those who came before you. Don't try to, reinvent the wheel, is what the point is that recognize what's going on and do the best you can. In 1 Corinthians 3, 4 through 6, in a passage about preachers, the point is a preacher shouldn't go into an established congregation acting like he's the first preacher who's ever been there. Is that he has to see that there were things that happened beforehand that he has to figure out how that worked, what worked well, and how he can then add to what was done in the past. And elders are the same way. You also have to recognize the impact of past problems. That there's going to be some residue left over. Anytime there's a problem, there's going to be some stuff hanging over there that a lot of times is making decisions for some people if that problem really made an impact on them. It's going to differ depending on different people, but we have to recognize it and move on from there. And then we have to understand what motivates different people. Not everyone is motivated the same way and for the same reasons. In Philemon 12 through 14 and verse 17, Paul, in addressing a personal letter to his friend, he understood what motivated him, and that's what he used in addressing him about freeing Onesimus. He understood the man and what his motivations were, and he was showing him why this mattered then in the big picture. And that's why we have to understand people and their background too. Well, everyone then, in knowing people's backgrounds, recognize it on an individual basis. You go to Romans chapter 16, 3 through 16, Paul lists all these different people that are contributing and doing different things in the work. So here's the thing. Everyone has a story, and there is always going to be something else to consider for people. So everybody's got a past, but that doesn't equal the future unless you live there. And that's why we need to use it as a basis and a foundation for trying to grow and move forward as a people. Now, you probably realize that the circumstances Nehemiah found himself in were extreme. He was fulfilling the roles of foreman, general, governor, and more all at the same time. But the reality is that most leaders must use these same type of skills in principle, even when the situations are not as extreme. To be effective, all leaders must learn to adapt to challenging situations, changing needs. They've got to know what people they can trust and what people they simply can't, while still loving them without fail. They've got to recognize that responsibilities are theirs alone and what they should train others to do. And they must maintain a perspective that always remains aware of the past of others and how it affects their perspective. So good leaders are constantly analyzing the situation, evaluating the participants, improving the process, and considering the past. Why? Because that's part of being a leader. Leaders do these things so that they can find not fault or feel important, but because leadership is about helping others fulfill their potential and reaching their goals too. And a good understanding of the problems and the people are essential to accomplish that. But there's one more thing to consider. At some point in almost every leader's life, he's going to be called upon to make decisions and do things that are critical to the survival, future, and well-being of the congregation, and certainly some of those who follow. The understanding he is building is not necessary to maintain routine. We can just go about routine, no problem. But this is essential for survival, for growth, and progress as a people of God. Jesus understood all these things we needed, and that's why he came. He understood that his trust ought to focus in God, grow in his relationship with disciples, and he did not only what he could do, but he also delegated the task of spreading the gospel to his apostles, a message about listening to it, trusting God, repenting of sin, confessing faith in him, and being baptized for the remission of sins. It's the same message today. That's what Jesus died to lead you to. And if you're subject to that message now, won't you please come while we stand and sing.